Welcome to this week's episode of Everyday Thin Places. I'm Rachel Gallagher, and I'm an interfaith hospice chaplain.
And I'm Elizabeth Ferrasso, and I'm a birth doula.
And in each episode of Everyday Thin Places, we draw from our experiences supporting birthing people and dying people to explore with honesty, authenticity, and humor how we can all become more truly living people.
All right, so fire. We could have taken the element of fire in so many different directions. We've talked about our little bit of an obsession with candles. We're not going to talk about candles for this next hour, but one thought that we had, Rachel, was that we would talk about campfires in order to talk about this element in fire, because it's something that we both sort of have meaningful relationships with. Campfire in our history. So what is that for you? What does it mean to you to think about the power of fire as a campfire?
Yeah, I think I've maybe alluded to this before in prior conversations that we've had, but campfires play a really big role in my life, which is funny because I'm not a camper. I'm not particularly excited about setting up a tent and sleeping on the ground, but I've shared a little bit about this camp that has been a big part of my life out in Maui, this camp called Camp Koru. It's for young adult cancer survivors. And we go out there, and for a week, we spend time living in these really rustic cabins and learning how to surf and stand-up paddleboard. But at night, when we're not surfing and stand-up paddleboarding, we have campfire every night. And it's such an important aspect of camp. Sure, I learned to surf there and had some really great Hawaiian experiences. But when I think about cancer camp, the most meaningful part for me has always been those campfires. So we do it every night. We all sit around and we decompress and debrief on the day. And I don't know, there's something magical about sitting around that fire, watching the glow, feeling close to nature, where people who were strangers just a couple days earlier are willing to be vulnerable and open up about just how powerful their experience on the island is, and to share about their cancer experience. And it's just so meaningful. And I think that the fire, there's just something about that fire, like all of us sitting in a circle, looking into the glowing fire together. I don't know, there's something magical about it, and it's definitely a thin place for me. When I think about my time on Maui, that is one of the thin places that I remember. How about you? Any campfire stories or experiences?
Absolutely. So most of the camping, what we would call camping experience that I had that's so memorable for me growing up was time spent with my grandparents. So my grandparents had a trailer that they stayed in all summer. They had their house, but they weren't even in their house all summer long. They just had this trailer at this cool campground an hour or so away. And all of the cousins would take turns getting to go and spend like a week at a time. And so sometimes it would be me and one of my siblings, or sometimes it would be me and one of my cousins would just get to go. And all sorts of traditions of, fishing, of playing in the inner tube in the lake, and driving the car. That's one of our traditions that we were allowed to like take a turn driving the car through the fields. But the campfire, like that was just such a special time. And I remember, snuggling with my grandma and being around the fire. And a huge part of that was singing. And then we had these songs, and they're songs that everyone in my family, all of my cousins and my siblings and my aunts, like everybody knows all the words to those songs, because when I think of them, I like almost can feel the warmth of the fire on my face and the sound of either my grandma or my grandpa's voice being the one that talked about, or we're singing the song. And when I sort of realized the impact of this was actually when my third child was born, I had a name that I really wanted to name my first, and it was a no-go. My husband was not about it. And then the second was a boy, and it was a girl's name, so it wasn't going to work for him. And when we were having another girl, I fought really, really, really hard for the name Clementine, because I love the name Clementine. I felt like it was like a pain in my body that I felt if I was not going to be able to name this child Clementine. And I don't think I had realized that part of the allure was that the song Clementine was one of those songs that everyone in our head, in our family, we could hear our grandpa singing around the fire. And so when I realized the impact of it was when we shared the name with all of the cousins and all of the aunts and all the siblings on that side of the family. And like people broke down in tears when they realized that we had named her Clementine and her middle name was my grandmother's first name. And so there's just such a strong family connection of those really carefree summer days as a kid. Like, what is better than that? And that's what I think of. And so when I returned to the campfire, even as the parent who like had to be the one to shop for the s'mores and like is like refereeing the fights between the children so that no one burns themselves, I still get to sort of return to that carefree, like beautiful family time of being around a fire, and how you never lose that sense of wonder that you get around there. So we realized for these conversations that we had, we knew that this concept of campfire was like a really powerful thing. And it just so happens, I am so fortunate that I got to be the doula for some amazing people. I still think it's just such a privilege that I even got to meet them for being their doula. But Ilyssa and Dave Q are the authors of a book called Campfire Stories, Tales from America's National Parks. So actually, when I met them and they were about halfway through their pregnancy and I was helping them prepare, they had just returned from a trip of visiting 6 of our national parks in order to go visit, be on site, understand what that place was really like and what stories were really meaningful there, so that they could write this collection of campfire stories. And so because we had already had this beautiful connection of me being their doula, they were so gracious to talk to us, to share with us about their experience of writing this book and what the power of this campfire experience means. And I don't know about you, Rachel, but I feel like I learned so many things and thought about so many different perspectives that I thought I knew campfires and I thought I knew stories and the meaningfulness of being around a campfire. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for bringing them into my life, because otherwise I don't know that our paths would have crossed. But I just really enjoyed our time talking to them and hearing about, they went to 6 national parks in order to gather these stories. And I just found it to be so fascinating, the similarities between campfire stories and what campfires mean throughout this country, really. They traveled lots of miles. I don't know how many miles they went, but, 6 national parks that were not right next to each other. And so to hear, kind of like the unity that exists in the experience of a campfire, but also to hear how they are different. You and I are both East Coast people, and Dave and Ilyssa were traveling from the East Coast, and to kind of hear the perspective of how campfires are different on the West Coast of the United States was really something that I had never thought about. So I just found this whole conversation to be fascinating and interesting, and I know that our listeners will too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, then let's get to it. Let's let everyone hear this interview that we did with authors of the book Campfire Stories, Tales from America's National Parks, Dave and Ilyssa Q.
Dave and Ilyssa, thank you for joining us. I guess it'd be great to just hear a little bit from you about how you got the idea to gather a collection of campfire stories and a bit about how your book came to be.
Sure. So the idea initially came from, I guess it was 2016, and I thought it would be a really cute gift to get Dave a collection of campfire stories. We had just started going camping a lot. Our love kind of grew alongside going camping and on adventures, and we didn't grow up camping. And so anytime we were sitting around the fire, I always sort of felt like it would be fun to have stories to share. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the first place I went to look was on Amazon, and I didn't quite find what I was looking for. And so I just was like, well, maybe I'll just make one. And which is kind of my general spirit. If I can't find what I want, I just decide that I'm either going to work on it as a project or think about it and put it in the backlog for later. And so the first step, I went to the Free Library of Philadelphia, and I just gathered a ton of folklore books, and I checked out probably 20 something books, and I got home and we're sitting at our table and I'm just like, what am I doing? Who am I to pick what makes a good campfire story? What makes a good campfire story? And I realized really quickly there was a lot more thought that had to go into it and a lot more structure. So it also coincidentally happened to be the centennial celebration of the National Park Service. And that was definitely on our mind. We spent every summer going to Acadia National Park and making trips to other national parks. And we thought that, hey, it might be pretty cool to sort of orient the campfire storybook around national parks. And that's when it started to really take shape and take form. And I think at the same time, Dave and I were feeling a little bit, not stuck, but we just wanted a little bit of a change in our life. And we weren't sure if that was moving, doing something else with our career. And I think Dave might have thrown out the idea, I don't know, maybe I did, of, hey, what if we use creating this book as a way of traveling or an excuse to travel to these places? And, after doing the initial research at the library and doing some online research to find national park stories, we realized pretty quickly that it was pretty important to travel to the places to understand each place, the essence of each place, to even know how to decide what defines that place or is the best story to express or share that place. So that's sort of how we got to hitting the road to collect those stories.
Yeah, we decided that we would be unable to tell the story of a place just because the place is so complicated, place is so emotional. So we would have to spend time in each of the places that we were trying to convey. So we've decided that was, we tested out the process, just talking to as many people as we could, talking to both people who are professionally kind of involved in representing place, but also people who live there, as many people as we could catch off the street and just have conversations with. We spent time going through archives and libraries and all materials that we could get to try to stitch together this portrait of place that felt authentic and also entertaining. And we found that was actually a 2-week process. In the first week, you get all the kind of professionals, people who work for travel agencies, National Park Service. They'll be the first people to talk to you. But once they understand kind of what you're looking for, then you can get to hey, you should actually talk to Diver Ed, or you should talk to, this person was declared a national treasure by the Clinton administration, so you should talk to that person. So in the second week, you can get to the kind of a more lived life layer of people who can tell stories about place. So we did that in 6 national parks across the country.
And we did quite literally meet people around campfires in some of the parks that we went to, which was pretty fun to get to know a community around a fire, and be sort of sent in another direction to interview other folks from around a campfire. So that was fun. Yeah, and when we had the idea initially, we realized that there were some upfront expenses in terms of gaining copyright license to republish stories, hiring illustrators, designers for the book. So, we thought of the idea for a Kickstarter, but I think why we decided to pursue that was to just make sure that this was something that other people wanted. So it was a little bit of like market research, that it wasn't just us who wanted this collection of stories. And that was sort of the main driver of that. And we exceeded our own goal, which was really exciting. I think the goal was initially around 15,000, and we ultimately raised about $20,000.
Wow.
So that was pretty cool. And, as far as like market research goes, it wasn't just people in the United States. There's people internationally who have this sort of longing for the national parks and perhaps campfire stories, sort of the lore of the national parks in the States. So that was pretty exciting to just see how much excitement there was for the idea beyond just the two of us. And then actually one of our backers for the Kickstarter, James Edward Mills, he's also an author, and he's somebody who works in the outdoor industry. He thought what we were doing was exciting and important, and he connected us to his publisher, Mountaineers Books, and that's how ultimately we found our publisher. So
Awesome.
Very cool.
So what do you think it is about this experience of sitting around a campfire, that fire in particular, that makes storytelling so meaningful and maybe even powerful in the human experience?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times people are sharing that time and space with people that are special to them in some way, whether friends or family. And I think in a lot of cases, you're somewhere that's sort of outside of your day-to-day, your sort of like normal element. And you might either be like outside your comfort zone or like totally in your comfort zone. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. You might be like totally at home, at peace around the fire, and that's sort of what makes it so special to share with someone. Or you could be somewhere where you're just like, what's beyond the trees? Like, I'm in the complete dark. And that's what makes for a really good, scary campfire story.
Yeah.
I, funny enough, do not like scary stories. So you won't find a scary story in our book. I think for us, when we go camping, when we visit national parks, when we're sitting around a campfire, we're often sort of recharging and reflecting about our day, and we're almost getting ready for the next day, and we're kind of using it as a moment to learn more about where we are, whether that's through like maps or brochures or information about where we are. And that was kind of part of the initial idea for orienting the book around national parks, specifically that people could sort of take this book with them to the various national parks and use this book as a nighttime read around the campfire to learn more about the people, the animals, the environment, and the history of where they are.
I think of a couple of people we encountered while we were traveling. One of the goals of the book was to tell the stories of a wider array of people, both the communities that have kind of come together to preserve those places, but also the indigenous stories of people who inhabited those places that were then taken away. And I remember talking to Ben Pikyovit, a Paiute elder right outside of Zion National Park. And he's a famous storyteller in the Paiute culture. So we asked if he had any short stories he might share with us. And he said, well, it's summer. So if I tell you a story in the summer, a rattlesnake will come visit me. And I don't like rattlesnakes.
Wow.
So I'm not going to tell you a story. And we were kind of like, rats. Okay. But there's what that told us. One, what that told us was there's a sacred aspect of what you do and when you do it. But in the summer, there's just too much to do. You're going and getting the resources you're storing up for a long winter. So those stories are not allowed to be told. It's idle time when you should be active. It's over the winter, over the colder months where it's cold, so you set up a campfire and you come together and share those stories. That's the time for when these things happen. So I feel like we have been doing the act of coming together around a campfire and telling each other stories that give us a little bit of meaning about how we're living and why we're living. We've been doing that for such a long time, for more generations than we can understand. So I think of Ben and just the simple superstition, but with how much conviction he told us. When I think about why fires are important and why they're such a wonderful setting for sharing stories with each other.
Absolutely. It's so funny. Ilyssa, you said like for some people that's the comfort zone and for some people it's not their comfort zone. I know our listeners can't see the video footage. I don't know if you caught Rachel's face. We just had this conversation in the episode that will have aired just before this about how it's very much in my comfort zone for our family to go camping. And it is very much like her love life actually came to be what it was because she and her husband were both able to be honest about not really liking it at all. So to each their own. However, maybe if it's not a campfire outside, I love sort of that concept of the winter months when there is just time. And maybe it's an indoor fire that you gather around and there's storytelling and there's meaning making. And also how you said there's, you surround yourself with people that you enjoy being with. It's meaningful time. I don't think of any campfires as being, oh gosh, I can't stand that person. You're with the people that you love being with the most. And that's why it's such deep memories.
There's something so like primal about a campfire. I feel like even if you don't feel connected to the people you're with in terms of your conversation or knowing them, like you can happily sit around a campfire together and stare into the void and enjoy the sounds, the crackling of the fire and the environment you're in and feel connected in sort of this different way. And I think that's really special too.
I love that. I never thought about it as like, this is something like I'm totally outside of my comfort zone, but this is a way that I can draw closer to the people that I'm with. And I'm just going to think of campfires in a whole new way now because they have been so meaningful in my life. And maybe that is why, because I've been pushed beyond my comfort zone. You're giving me stuff to think about. So since you guys have traveled across the country in order to gather these stories, did you notice any common themes that came up in different places?
So one common thing that came up that's kind of funny and kind of contrary to what you might think, we realized early on not to talk to storytellers, believe it or not. So we sort of prototyped the process in Acadia National Park just to see who we should be talking to and how we should be going about it. And pretty soon into it, and I think in the Smoky Mountains too, we just realized that talking to like traditional oral storytellers, they didn't quite. Do you want to kind of talk about that? They're kind of purist when it comes to the written word. And they were really sort of against the idea of capturing a story through text. which kind of took away from the conversation of sharing sort of the essence of place through story. And what's the quote that's like, I'll kind of let you jump in.
Which one?
It was like something about like when the word is written down, it dies.
Yeah. A lot of storytellers would just echo that.
You're killing the stories.
As soon as you put it in writing, you kill it, was the sentiment that we heard over and over. And the idea was just like, we're storytellers because we weren't so great at school. We are storytellers because in this medium we can use all these other aspects of, we can use pacing, we can use our bodies, we can use characters, faces, and tell you a story. But as soon as you write it down, it like loses all of the elements that we're good at. So we thought we'd reach out to storyteller groups, storytellers. They would tell us tons of great stories and we'd have a ton of content for the book. But as soon as we told them we were writing a book, they were like, nope, not us.
Wow. So we quickly revised our process, and who we were talking to is to sort of talk to the people who were essential in each place. So say in Maine, we made sure we talked to like boat builders and lobstermen and, all these folks that sort of capture the essence of place. And then we used what we learned from them and the themes coming from our conversations as like a rubric for what kinds of stories we needed to collect and share to make sure that it captured these diverse experiences and people in each place. So to kind of go back to your question, there wasn't really a ton in common between all the parks because they are so unique and the people we spoke to were so unique and all the themes were pretty unique. But I think that in general, we found that people were really emotionally tied to each place. And a lot of the national parks and the areas around them can be really difficult and rugged places to live, whether it's really cold or there's constant wildfires and sort of these like larger environmental threats, or there's not a lot of amenities, for example. But people choose to live there because, as one person stated, you're sort of paid in sunrises and sunsets. And there's just this really deep emotional connection that people feel to each of these places. And that was sort of the common theme that we found. And we would just be having interviews about what people loved about each place. And there were like tears that came from these, like what we thought were simple kinds of questions. And it was really special to learn about a place through their eyes.
So what you're saying is anybody who picks up this book that you've put together is going to want to visit all these places if they haven't already.
Oh, for sure. And that's kind of the hope. I think the book in a way not only encourages like having a campfire, but even like a metaphorical campfire where people can kind of sit and read to themselves and sort of dream of going to these places one day, or sit with other people and kind of plan out their adventures together. But the hope is to kind of inspire people to travel to some of these national parks.
Mm-hmm. And can you share with our listeners which parks you went to?
Yeah. Do you want to do it?
We started out in Acadia National Park. And we planned this in order of the road trip that we were able to take. So we started out in Acadia National Park. We drove down to the Smoky Mountains, drove west from there to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, then to Yosemite.
Zion?
Zion. I forgot Zion. I stopped by in the desert of Zion, then drove to Yosemite, and then back up to Yellowstone.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
I should probably also mention, because it feels wrong not to mention it, that we found out 3 weeks into our trip that I was pregnant. So in addition to the campfires that we were having, I felt like I was on fire from the inside. I think it was right about Zion when we hit a heat wave of like 115 degrees for a 3-day stretch. And we started out camping and it did not get cooler at night. Well, it did, but it went down to 95 degrees.
Oh my gosh.
And I was at that point in my pregnancy where I was just burning up inside. And for my birthday, Dave got us a one night stay at a bed and breakfast. That was very key.
So I'm kind of curious, besides the sort of idea of storytelling, because this is sort of, we're thinking of this episode as a chance to ponder this idea of fire as one of the 4 essential elements of life. Was there anything else, either practical or metaphorical, or in any way that you learned about fire or campfire during your research for this book, during this time that you were out traveling?
Yeah. So being from and living in the Northeast, I think we have this really quaint view of campfires. And the further west that we traveled, we sort of discovered that campfires are not really universal, that in many states, campfires are really dangerous. And because of the effects of climate change, there's really high risk on a daily basis that people face with fire in general, and not just campfires, with like lighting a cigarette or using a generator. And so I think in a lot of the Western parks and rural towns that we stopped in along the way, we were just far more aware of fire and the risk of fire and how it affects everyone's behavior on a daily, hourly basis. And my friend who lives in Mariposa, having conversations with her as far as like fire plans. And, we at one point were staying in a cabin where we had to like purchase a metal bucket to put our ashes in. And I'm like, we never do that on the East Coast, but there's just a lot of more precautions that you have to take, and things that you have to think about when you're there.
I think one idea that's coming back because of climate change is kind of making these catastrophic fires happen more frequently. And a thing that the National Park Service actually did, in the 50s, there was this idea that came over the Park Service about kind of wanting to preserve the good nature. We want specific Disney World type of natural experiences for people to visit. So fires in the national parks were things that they fought vigorously. They didn't want any of those to happen. But over time, as we've kind of are working our way through generations, we're finding that fires actually have positive purposes in landscapes. There are certain types of pine cones that actually that are dropped that only open once the intense heat of a fire can open up that acorn, and it burns away the old growth forest and finally opens up these acorns and allows for new growth forests to come in. And I know they're starting to have that conversation in California of after we're having worse and worse wildfire seasons about what if we brought these controlled fires back. Fire actually has a really important purpose in the natural cycle of life. So even though it is destructive to property, even though it is destructive to the way we live, we need to find a way to kind of reincorporate this very natural idea back into our way of life.
I like that. There's so much that's a metaphor that we could take in so many different directions, thinking about our planet, thinking about just our lives. Yeah.
I mean, I always do use the metaphor of the pine cone in my life. I definitely, in moments where, I feel really anxious or I feel like things didn't quite work out the way I wanted them to, or something bad really happened, I always look for sort of the opening pine cone, the seed in that destruction, to sort of regrow a new idea or a new direction. And yeah, that's always been like an important metaphor in our lives and in some of the decisions that we've made in our careers.
It makes me think about one of the stories in the Acadia chapter is a poem called Fire by Bill Carpenter. It's about a man who wakes up one day and sees his neighbor's house on fire. And he thinks, that's a great idea. So he starts a fire in his own house and he starts throwing all his belongings into the fire. Just all his books, all his clothes. He's really getting it going, and looks back across the river and sees that his neighbor has called the fire department. They're putting out the fire, and he goes, that person chickened out. So he continues his fire and really sees it as a rebirth. When we had the chance to do a reading with Bill, we got to go back to Acadia, and Bill read that poem for us. And he actually revealed, I think somebody in the audience asked just about, I don't get why this person is burning down his house or a question like that. And he talked about where the inspiration comes from. And it's actually a story that he wrote while he was going through a divorce. So it's this idea of like, he's burning it all down. He needs to start anew. And there's actually something really, I don't know if nice is the right word, but regenerative about the opportunity to kind of go back down to nothing, just the clothes on your back, and starting anew from there.
I love that. That's a really hopeful perspective. Because sometimes we do choose to burn it all down. Sometimes it just feels like it's happening around us.
Yeah.
And I love that idea that it can really be regenerative.
Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day and out of your lives to share with us and our listeners. We like to encourage our listeners to be generous and to kind of return the favor, I guess, in a way. And so we like to ask our guests if there's any sort of organization or cause or place that you would direct people to be generous. Where can we tell our listeners about?
I think for our book that's about parks that span the entire country, there's no one place we could point people to. Each park is pretty distinct, and actually they're really far apart. So I think what we try to do with the book is just call out all the different people and the different organizations that are doing the work of sustaining these places. So at the end of the book, we listed a lot of those nonprofit organizations or friends groups, people who use whatever money comes to them to sustain and protect these places so that everybody can enjoy them. And it's a big list, but it's because there are 6 national parks and entire ecosystems around each individual park to sustain and do a lot of the work that needs to be done. So we can share that list with you, but there's always going to be a huge need. There's a huge list, and we hope you take a look at not only these resources, but also the people that sustain the parks in your area.
Yeah, I'll jump in and share. I think if you've ever been thinking about giving to any of these groups related to local or say national parks, now is really the time to give. Due to the pandemic, a lot of their key fundraising events and programs have been canceled, and they're really having a tough time and having to adjust and move to virtual events, which obviously just don't have the same impact. So it's a really good time to give to these organizations.
Well, we will definitely provide links for our listeners on our website for the long list of places that they can be generous.
Great. Thank you.
And then after people figure out how to give to each one of these parks, they can figure out how to get themselves to each one of those parks across their lifetime. I feel like we always have such good homework from this podcast, whether it's to, write a poem or to dip in water. There's different things that our guests have encouraged us for ways that we could experience, as we call this podcast, everyday thin places, where you just experience the good stuff of being human by all the different ways to be a truly alive person. And so visiting these parks and enjoying the wonder and amazement of fire as a source of bringing people together and as a source of even bringing about regeneration, I think is an amazing thing to think about. So thank you so much for this time that you've spent with us. And I guess this is a good time to tease the fact that we will have you two back next summer for another episode when you have another project out in the world that we get to share with everyone.
Yes, we're looking forward to it.
So this is not goodbye. This is just goodbye for now.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
Thanks for joining us. Now it's our turn to hear from you. So would you do us a big favor and go into your podcast app and rate us? Even better, would you write us a glowing review? That will help other listeners to find us. And make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode.
You can also visit our website at everydaythinplaces.com, where you will find all sorts of fun and interesting information, as well as learn about how you can help to support this podcast and earn special exclusive perks. There you will also find links to follow us on social media, or else just pop directly over to Instagram or Facebook, where you will find us at Everyday Thin Places. Thanks so much for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Rachel. Bye.